Welt or flat seam. Welt or flat seam. The choice of seams very much depends on the fabric of the garment or product. Seams generally used for lightweight fabrics are not suitable for heavyweight fabrics. For heavy, bulkier fabric, the welt seam is apt. And it is this welt seam that we are going to learn in this class. Objectives: at the end of this class, you will be able to identify a welt or a flat seam. Sew a welt or a flat seam. What is a welt or a flat seam? This is what the welt seam looks like. The welt seam is a good way to reduce bulk and hold seam allowance flat on heavyweight fabrics. Let's see how to do a welt seam on a sample. The procedure of sewing the welt seam. You will need the following items to do this sample: jeans fabric, straight ruler,
pattern square,
straight pins, measuring tape, tailor's chalk, shears, small scissors, contrasting thread, iron, sewing machine. Now let's begin. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample jeans fabric pieces. At the outset, take 2 layers of bulky fabric like jeans. Measure and draw 10-inch by 10-inch square on it with the help of a ruler,
pattern square,
measuring tape, and a tailor's chalk. Using the shears, cut the marked squares. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Now take one of the fabric pieces and lay it on the table with its wrong side up. Using a
pattern square,
measuring tape and tailor's chalk, mark 1-inch seam allowance along one of its cut edges. Now pin the 2 pieces with the right side together with the marked seam line on the upper side. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Now we will start stitching. Press the reverse stitch lever and start with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Leave the reverse stitch lever and stitch along the seam line with a normal stitch length. Again, press the reverse stitch lever and end with the reverse stitch to prevent the seam from opening. Snip the thread with a pair of small scissors and remove the straight pins. Step 4. Press the seam allowance. Press the seam line with an iron. Then open the fabric so that the right sides of the fabric are no longer together. Then press the seam allowance to one side. Step 5. Trim the seam allowance. Trim the in-between seam allowance to 1/4 inch. Step 6. Top stitch the seam allowance. Right side up, top stitch 3/8 inch away from the seam, catching not the trimmed seam allowance but the untrimmed seam allowance underneath. When done, snip the thread with a pair of small scissors. Finally, you have your sample with the welt seam ready. Please note, here we are using a contrasting thread for demonstration purposes only, so that it is visible, but otherwise one would use a thread matching the fabric. With that, we come to the end of this class. Let's recall what we have learned in this class. This is what the welt seam looks like. It is a good way to reduce bulk and hold seam allowance flat on heavy weight fabrics. The procedure of sewing the welt or flat seam, let's review its basic steps. Step 1. Measure, mark, and cut out the sample jeans fabric pieces. Step 2. Mark the seam allowance. Step 3. Stitch the seam. Step 4. Press the seam allowance. Step 5. Trim the seam allowance. Step 6. Top stitch the seam allowance. This is the welt or the flat seam. So now you have learned all about the welt seam. Take our next class to learn about the French seam.